Good morning, and it's great to be with you again, even if it is just electronically. It's been several weeks since we've been together physically, and it's been quite a few weeks since I've been able to produce a Bible class. So I appreciate your patience. I thank you so much, Mark, for jumping in there and filling that void while I was away. I do apologize that last week we didn't have a Bible class for Mark or for myself. Over the last several weeks, my family has dealt with some tragedy. There have been others, families in the congregation who've dealt with this kind of thing. And I just really appreciate Mark for jumping in there and teaching Bible class for us. It is our Bible class, and I do appreciate it. You did a wonderful job, and thank you so much. We are going to continue this week with our study of 1 Peter. We're going to be in chapter 3, in the first 7 verses of chapter 3. So be turning over there over the next few minutes while I continue to thank some folks that need to be thanked. Number one, like I said, we've been dealing with this tragedy, the sudden loss of Missy's dear mother, my mother-in-law, Pam Mills, and also some news that her father has been struggling with respect to his own health. And I just wanted to extend a thank you for Missy and on behalf of the family for all of the thoughtful cards, phone calls, text messages, and concerns that many of you have expressed over the course of the last several weeks since we lost Pam and have been dealing with some of this other news. So I sincerely appreciate it. It meant a great deal to Missy, and it means a great deal to me as well. So thank you so much for being so kind during this difficult time. As I said, we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 3, and looking forward to getting started again on that. It's been a while since we've been together and been able to do it, so I'm eager to share with you some stuff. So open your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 1, and follow along with me there if you will. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without talking by the behavior of their wives. I love teaching in 1 Peter, but I'll be honest with you, I usually try to stay away from 1 Peter chapter 3, particularly verses 1 through 7, because there are 6 verses in here that are instruction or, requests of wives, and 1 verse that is a request of husbands. And so I really try to avoid teaching on this because it doesn't seem very even-handed. But in the context of what we've studied over the last several weeks while we were talking about 1 Peter, it talks about submitting to the government. It talks about submitting to our employers, slaves submitting to their masters. It talks about that level of submission. And really Peter goes on and elaborates on that level of submission in talking about the relationship with husbands and wives. Submission to the husband, though, is not a reward for the husband's good behavior. Those of you that are wives know that. Certainly Missy knows that. Submission is not that. Christian women in the first century who came to Jesus before their husbands needed this instruction. They needed this instruction because they were efforting to win over their husbands and win them to Christ. It's the best and most effective way to affect change. You know, right now we're dealing with a lot of things in the country and in the world with coronavirus and with the protests, and that kind of evolved or devolved into riots over the last several weeks. And I'm sure many of you are like me in wishing that we could return to some version of what we remember normal to be. But unfortunately, this is the times that we find ourselves in. But this instruction to wives here that Peter gives in the first verse is an instruction that says this type of influence, this peaceful type of influence, is a much better way to affect the change that you're wanting to affect. I see people behaving in certain ways and acting out and in their rage, and I wonder, not that I question the motivations, and I certainly don't want to get political with this conversation this morning, but I wonder if that's the most effective way to bring about the kinds of change that they're espousing to want. And that when we see something unfair, we all want. This instruction that Peter gives says, live the example that you want your husbands to become, so that they'll see your example that you've lived and be persuaded. I'm going to read that verse again. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without talk by the behavior of their wives. They may see Christ in you and be persuaded. He goes on to say, when they see the purity and the reverence of your lives, the purity and the reverence of your lives will be a persuasive argument without words. It'll be a wordless argument. It'll be a living example. I love the instruction that he gives. He goes on to say some things here that people may take out of context. But before we get to verse 3, he says the word here in some translations, likewise. He says, submit likewise. Proper submission in the home follows the same principles as the submission to the government and to our employers that was mentioned in chapter 2. Proper submission looks just exactly like that pattern. A submission not only of actions, but also a submission of the heart is what he's talking about to these wives. The instructions of wives to be subject to their husbands should never be taken to imply or to infer, or should not be inferred that they are inferior in personhood or inferior in spirituality or of lesser importance than their husband. This submission doesn't imply any of those things. So it's not supposed to be inferred when we read this that they're in any way lesser in spirituality or lesser in personhood or lesser in importance. In verse 3, he goes on to say, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. It's interesting. This is a verse that's been taken and warped way out of context. Let's listen to what he says. He says, your beauty should not come from these things, and he lists these things. In fact, the word fine is not even in the original manuscript. It's just from clothes. And the reason why is the people that Peter is talking to here in the first century, at this time, women had a trend, and we have fashion trends even today. I see teenagers, young ladies with blue hair. Riley has a girlfriend that he's dating right now, and she has blue hair. It looks great on her. And if I had hair, it's a persuasive argument. I may go blue, I may go purple. I'm not sure. Sydney's favorite color is purple, but it's just the latest fashion trend, and there'll be something else. At this time in the first century, women wanted to have blonde hair here in these locations that Peter is talking to, and so they would buy these wigs that came from Germany, these blonde wigs, and they would weave them into their hair. He's not saying that those things are wrong. He's not saying that jewelry is wrong. He's not saying that clothes, fine or otherwise, are wrong. What he's saying is your beauty shouldn't come from those things. Your beauty should come from something more. He goes on to say in verse 4, instead it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. He's saying what your beauty should come from. He's not forbidding the wearing of these things. He's simply stating that these adornments should never be the wife's source of beauty. Should be from within. In Proverbs 31, there's a passage at the end of that chapter that talks about the noble wife and the characteristics of the noble wife. And one of the ways it describes her later in that reading is that she is clothed in strength and dignity. Clothed in strength and dignity. It doesn't mean that she's not also clothed, because it mentions it earlier than that she has purple garments, and that's certainly a fine clothing of that time, but that she's clothed in strength and dignity. There's more to her than the outward adornments. And it's a beautiful thing. And it says it's not only beautiful to the husband, it's not only beautiful to the world, it's beautiful in the sight of God. This inner beauty is incorruptible. It's something that's not going to perish, spoil, or fade. It's like the inheritance that we talked about in chapter 1. It is an incorruptible beauty. Holy women who trusted God are a good example. He describes that. He goes on to describe the example of Sarah. And let's read that, if you will. In verse 5, "For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to make themselves beautiful." Sorry, let me read that again. "For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear." He describes holy women who trust God and are obedient. And he describes Sarah, and in doing that, he gives two examples of these characteristics or attributes that she had. He describes her as being obedient, and he describes her as being someone who showed honor to her husband. She obeyed Abraham, and what's great about Sarah is she obeyed Abraham even when Abraham was wrong. In Genesis chapter 12, we read an account there, and you can in your own time look it up. But it was when he came into a land and decided that he was going to give an incomplete truth about his relationship with Sarah to the ruler of the area there, and he was wrong, and Sarah obeyed him anyway. Sarah honored Abraham. She called him Lord, and showed great respect and reverence and honor for Abraham. These attributes should be present in wives' submission to their husband. Again, not because the husband is good and right and deserving of it. It's in obedience that wives have these attributes. True submission knows the place of obedience and honor. He uses a word here, I don't know that you have it in your translation, but he says, to do good. True submission is not sulking submission to authority, but it is an active embrace of God's will. Demonstrating your trust in God. It's not doing it the way sometimes when we ask our kids to do something, they sulkingly submit. It is an active embrace of God's will. It's doing it eagerly and happily. I know that over the course of the last several weeks, I have been trying to teach Max how to drive. And he hates my constant instruction. I mean, he hates it. He hates my constant instruction. But when we're in a car, there is an authority. There is an authority. And it's not just the driver, although the driver is an authority. When you're in a permit situation, as Max is, then he's not the driver. He's not the authority. He's the driver, but I'm the authority. But ultimately, the law is the authority. Ultimately, what I'm giving Max instruction with regard to is staying within compliance of the law, doing what is necessary. The other day, he was not responding favorably to my constant instruction. And my instruction is basically prompted by fear. If I feel in the pit of my stomach that we are doing something that's dangerous, I begin to give instruction. And the longer he keeps me in that condition, the more instruction that I give. and it's peaceful and it's calm, but it's slow down, slow down, slow down, stop. You know, it's speed up, it's go. It's you know, you guys have taught your kids how to drive, and certainly this is not a new thing for me. But he was not responding well. He was becoming frustrated at the constant instruction that he was getting. And he was finding it hard to submit to so many instructions all coming at once, which is understandable. I can remember what it was like when my dad was teaching me to drive. We made this turn and we were along a not very busy street coming up to a red light, and I just decided I was going to withhold instruction and see what happens. Not give any direction. And as we were approaching the light, we weren't approaching it with eagerness. We weren't approaching it as if we had somewhere to go. We were kind of approaching it in a very slow, non-deliberate manner. And the light turned yellow. And Max, without my instruction, did not know whether to put his foot on the gas or put his foot on the brake. And so he didn't do either one. And as we got to the light, and we were now just basically rolling at about 20 miles an hour, we weren't stopping and we weren't speeding up, but the light was turning red and did turn red. And finally, I gave instruction as we were underneath a red light and said, we've got to go, and we did. And he was frustrated by that. He did not like that delayed instruction or the late instruction that came. And we had to have a conversation about it after it was over. Here, this instruction that wives receive, these 6 verses, sometimes the reaction to that instruction because of the lopsidedness of it, the fact that there are 6 verses dedicated here to the wives and only 1 dedicated to the husband, that paradigm kind of flips later in the Bible. There are other places where elsewhere husbands receive a lot more instruction, a lot more detailed instruction, but here it's 6 to 1. Sometimes it can not be received right, and we just have to be careful about how we receive our instruction. Here in verse 7, it goes on to give instruction to the husband, and read that with me if you will. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you in the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Now, depending upon the translation that you have, you may read that a little differently than I just read it. Some of the translations say live, some of them say dwell, but it's certainly not just share a house. It's to really be an active participant. Live and dwell with your wife. Don't just share a residence with your wife, but live and experience life and dwell with your wife. It says that a husband should, be considerate in my translation. It says more than that in some other translations. It says that a husband should understand the unity and oneness God established when he established marriage. You need to understand your wife. That can be a very perplexing thing, as husbands throughout time have tried to understand their wife. Missy and I have been married for nearly 30 years, and I'm still learning things about how complex and how intelligent and how wonderful and how full of incredible ideas Missy is. I'm still learning about the depth and breadth of Missy. But our instruction here is to understand our wife. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 28, it says that husbands should love their wives as they love their own bodies. You can't love anything maybe more completely than you love your own body. You take care of yourself, you feed yourself, you clothe yourself. When you have a need, however urgent it is, you take care of that need. The instruction in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28 is to love your wives as you love your own body, as you love yourself. It says husbands should treat them with respect and with understanding by knowing your wife's will. By knowing your wife's will, a godly husband will demonstrate his love. So by understanding and knowing your wife's will, you'll demonstrate your love for your wife. And this really is where husbands often fail. They fail in understanding, not in understanding, but in executing how that understanding should mean they should dwell with their wives. They should do this to give honor to their wife, but they struggle with it. They have the understanding, but they fail to understand how executing their dwelling with their wife should change the way they act. And there's lots of examples of that with me. I understand what Missy wants. Sometimes I challenge what Missy wants. I understand what Missy needs and would like to have. And sometimes I challenge or I fail to do that. The Love Languages book is a real good book that shines a light on this, on understanding our spouse and on giving our spouse what that understanding leads us to give them, to demonstrate our love and to honor our spouse by doing that. This is an interesting passage of Scripture, these 7 verses that talk about husbands and wives and the need to submit and to yield to one another. We talked about that idea of yielding in our discussion of employers and the government, how we need to yield to the government. I shared with you the story about Sydney and her driving and how she understood and loved that idea and that principle of yielding. We need to be yielding. We need to be yielding in our understanding of our spouse. Whether we're husbands or wives, we need to be yielding. We need to show honor. We need to show respect and honor as we dwell with one another together, as we more than just share a house, as we really live and experience life with one another. I hope that, like me, throughout this strange time we're in, really since March the 13th for me, that you found a way to find laughter, that you found a way to find things to smile about, things to do with your spouse that you haven't done before, that you've made the most of this time. Because this time, like our time on earth, is fleeting. We won't always be in quarantine. We won't always be social distancing. And one day, as we sit now in this condition, looking back on the way things used to be and longing for those times, one day we'll be back to some sense of normal and we'll be missing this time that we had with one another. So I'm hoping that you're making the most of this time, because this is time, though we've dealt with our struggles and difficulty, that God is giving us to do just that with, to make the most of it. And I hope that's what you're doing. I'm praying that's what you're doing. That's all I've got to share with you this morning. We will continue in 1 Peter chapter 3 next week. I hope you're reading along. I hope you're following along with me. I hope you're eagerly studying this as well. I have missed our time together, even if it's just this, and I hope all of you are doing well. Again, thank you so much for the cards, notes, letters, phone calls, and things that you've sent to the family on behalf of Missy and her family and the loss that they've experienced right now. I'm praying for all of you that are dealing with similar types of struggles. God bless you. I love you. I can't wait to see y'all again, and we'll be back like this again next week. God bless.